Savannah, Georgia, December 1995. Two close friends, Lisa Adams and Cole Mills, were found brutally murdered in Lisa's charming Victorian home. The scene was a nightmare: overturned furniture, shattered glass, and blood that told a story of rage far beyond reason. Nothing was stolen, no forced entry. Just two lives ended, violently, by someone they clearly trusted. Detectives combed through every inch of that house, fingerprints, blood, hair, but the trail went cold. For years it haunted the city, and the families who prayed for answers that never came. Then, decades later, when the case was all but forgotten, a single drop of blood whispered the truth. Modern DNA technology would expose a killer who had been hiding in plain sight, attending funerals, coaching youth teams, and shaking hands with the very people he'd deceived. It wasn't luck that caught him. It was science, persistence, and the unrelenting patience of justice. If you love real-life mysteries where truth triumphs over time, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful true crime documentaries. And tell us, where are you watching from tonight? We love seeing how far these stories reach. Your support helps bring justice back into focus, one forgotten case at a time. Savannah, Georgia, December 17th, 1995. A night that began like any other in the city's historic district. The streets were calm beneath the oak trees, their limbs draped with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the winter air. Behind one of those ornate Victorian facades on East Gaston Street, laughter echoed faintly through lace-curtained windows. Inside, Lisa Adams, a 28-year-old pediatric nurse, and Cole Mills, her lifelong best friend and a beloved high school teacher, had settled into their Sunday ritual: movies, wine, and the kind of easy companionship that only years of trust can build. But sometime after 9:30, that warmth turned to horror. Neighbors later recalled hearing what sounded like a heated argument, a crash, and then silence. No one called the police. Small scuffles weren't rare in this part of town. Yet behind Lisa's door, a nightmare was unfolding. The attack was swift, frenzied, and personal. Whoever had entered that home didn't come for money or valuables. They came with rage. When morning came, the winter air had grown bitterly cold, a rare frost glinting on the magnolia leaves outside. Lisa's roommate, Melissa Jenkins, returned from a weekend trip, expecting the comforting smell of coffee and chatter from the living room. Instead, she found the front door slightly ajar. The chill that hit her face wasn't just from the cold. It was something else, something primal. She stepped inside, calling out Lisa's name. What she saw would scar her for life. The living room looked like it had been torn apart by a storm. Furniture overturned, shards of glass catching the gray morning light. And then, just beyond the couch, Lisa, motionless. Melissa's scream pierced the quiet street as she stumbled backward and reached for the phone. "My roommate. And her friend. There's blood everywhere," she cried to the dispatcher. When police arrived minutes later, the sight inside stopped even the most seasoned officers in their tracks. Blood spatter lined the walls like violent brushstrokes. Lisa had been stabbed multiple times, her hands showing deep defensive wounds, signs she'd fought desperately. Cole's body was found in the hallway near the front door, suggesting he had tried to escape or protect her. The television still hummed faint static, a haunting soundtrack to the aftermath. Detective Lucas Moore, a veteran of Savannah's homicide division, was among the first on scene. He quietly surveyed the devastation before muttering words later recorded in his report. "This wasn't random. This was rage." No valuables were missing, no signs of forced entry. Whoever did this, Lisa and Cole had known them. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that two of its kindest souls lay inside that home, and that their killer had vanished into the cold morning air. But for those who saw that scene, one thing was certain: this was not just a crime, It was a message, carved in blood and silence, and for Savannah, it was the night innocence was lost. The house on East Gaston Street didn't just contain tragedy. It contained a story written in blood, angles, and chaos. Detective Lucas Moore knew it the moment he crossed the threshold. The air was thick with the metallic scent of iron and something colder. Guilt, maybe. It was the kind of scene that made even experienced investigators step back and take a slow breath. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was something far darker, something personal. Crime scene technicians began their meticulous sweep just after 9:30 a.m. They moved like ghosts through the quiet house, marking every drop of blood, every fingerprint smudge, every faint footprint on the hardwood floors. In the kitchen, streaks of blood led toward the sink, as if someone had tried to wash something away. Drops on the counter, the floor, even the faucet. He cut himself, Moore muttered, pointing to a small streak of diluted red where water had mixed with blood. He tried to clean up. In the hallway, the pattern of blood spatter told another story. Cole Mills had fought hard. He'd likely come to Lisa's defense, trying to push the attacker away, maybe even drawing them toward the door. But he hadn't made it. His body had collapsed only a few steps from the exit, one hand still clutching the doorknob as if he'd been inches from freedom. That detail would stay with Moore for years, a moment frozen between life and death. Forensic photographer Sarah Chen captured over 200 images that morning. Each photo was a fragment of truth: defensive wounds, overturned chairs, shattered wine glasses. A single movie still paused on the television, its frozen frame showing two friends laughing on screen, echoing the lives that had just been taken. It was haunting, almost poetic, in the worst possible way. Moore's notebook filled quickly. No forced entry, no valuables missing. Both victims knew the killer. The precision and rage in the attack told him this wasn't an opportunist. This was someone with history, someone whose anger had boiled over. When he spotted a partial fingerprint on the door frame smudged with blood, he knew it was something worth saving. "This might talk someday," he said, as if to himself. Outside, Savannah's winter sun climbed reluctantly into the sky. Neighbors watched from porches, whispering behind trembling hands. A few remembered hearing shouting the night before, but nobody had thought it serious enough to intervene. "If only we'd called," one woman told an officer, her eyes wet. It was the kind of regret that would echo through that street for decades. As evidence bags filled and technicians packed up, Detective Moore lingered in the doorway, staring at the house one last time. He didn't know it yet, but the samples collected that day, the blood, the hair, the partial print, would become the keys to a mystery that refused to die. The scene was silent now, but in that silence, the truth waited patiently for its turn to speak. Before they were victims, Lisa Adams and Cole Mills were the kind of people who made life better just by being in it. Their friendship wasn't something casual. It was the rare kind of bond that spanned decades, built on loyalty, laughter, and a quiet understanding that never needed words. They met as teenagers at a church summer camp outside Atlanta. Lisa was the empathetic listener, the one everyone confided in. Cole was the easygoing athlete with a grin that made people trust him instantly. Together they balanced each other, her heart, his humor, two sides of the same coin. By the time they were adults, life had taken them both to Savannah, that postcard-perfect city of cobblestone streets and whispering oaks. Lisa became a pediatric nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital, known for reading bedtime stories to frighten kids long after her shift ended. Cole became a history teacher and basketball coach at Savannah High, the kind of teacher who stayed after class to help struggling students, who drove kids home when they missed the bus, who believed in them when no one else did. They were, in every sense, the best kind of people. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, they met at Lisa's Victorian apartment for movie night. Popcorn, board games, and a bottle of wine were their simple ritual. Friends joked they were an old married couple in everything but romance. They laughed about it, too. "We're family by choice," Lisa once told her roommate Melissa, "and that's better than anything else. That ritual, that comfort, made their murders all the more incomprehensible. There was no drama, no dangerous secrets anyone could see, just two good souls who lived quietly, who helped others, and who never hurt anyone. Their families were shattered. Lisa's parents, Richard and Margaret Adams, drove from Atlanta that morning, numb and disbelieving. Cole's mother, Eleanor, collapsed when the police told her. Savannah, a city more accustomed to ghost tours than real horror, was stunned. At the joint funeral a week later, hundreds gathered beneath the sweeping Spanish moss at Bonaventure Cemetery. Friends, co-workers, former patients, and students, all standing shoulder to shoulder, united by grief. Lisa and Cole were laid side by side, their shared headstone inscribed with a line from one of Lisa's favorite poems. "True friendship multiplies the good in life and divides its evils." It was beautiful and heartbreaking. Standing near the back of that crowd was Dustin Moss, their longtime friend from high school. He wept publicly, spoke softly to reporters about his loss, and even carried Cole's casket as a pallbearer. No one suspected a thing. To everyone there, he was another grieving friend. But years later, when detectives looked back at the footage, his face would tell a different story, one that reeked of guilt hiding behind tears. At that moment, though, no one could have known. To them, Lisa and Cole's story had ended. But in truth, the real story was only beginning. When the news broke of Lisa and Cole's murders, Dustin Moss was one of the first to call the families. He cried on the phone. He offered to help with funeral arrangements. He even brought casseroles to Lisa's grieving parents' home, the kind of gestures only a trusted friend would make. To everyone who knew him, Dustin was the picture of empathy, soft-spoken, dependable, and visibly shaken by the loss. At the funeral, he stood near the front, dabbing his eyes with a folded handkerchief. When reporters asked for comments, he told them, "They were the best friends anyone could ask for. I just want whoever did this caught." His voice cracked perfectly, almost rehearsed. Then, as Cole's casket was carried toward the waiting hearse, Dustin stepped forward to take one of the handles. Cameras captured the image. Dustin, face solemn, walking beside the coffin of the man he'd called his brother. It was a moment that felt heartbreakingly human, until years later, when investigators replayed that footage and realized they were watching the killer carry his victim to the grave. Back then, though, no one saw the mask slipping. The police interviewed Dustin early in the investigation, as he was one of the closest people to both victims. He appeared cooperative, answering every question calmly. He said he'd been out of town, at a Christmas party in Charleston, South Carolina, the night of the murders. He gave names, phone numbers, even a few details about the party's decorations. The alibi checked out, at least on the surface. Two acquaintances confirmed he'd been there, and with hundreds of other leads to chase, detectives let him go. Behind closed doors, though, Detective Lucas Moore couldn't shake a strange feeling. He seemed too prepared, Moore later recalled, like a man who had already rehearsed every answer. Still, the lack of hard evidence left him no choice but to move on. Dustin faded into the background, back into the life of a grieving friend. He attended vigils, he posted tributes, he visited the graves, he even helped organize a scholarship fund in Cole's name. Every gesture made him seem more innocent, and made the truth even harder to see. Years passed. Dustin built a new life, a career in pharmaceutical sales, a wife, 2 children, and a house in a quiet Savannah suburb. He coached Little League, attended church, and hosted barbecues. To anyone looking from the outside, he was the embodiment of the American dream. But behind that well-kept lawn and polite smile, the past lingered. Silent, waiting. He had fooled everyone, even himself. He had walked among mourners, dined with the victims' families, and carried on as if nothing had happened. But buried deep in police evidence, storage sat a few tiny pieces of truth: blood, hair, and a partial fingerprint. Forgotten, yes, but not gone. And when technology caught up to the evidence, those fragments would tell a story Dustin never intended to be heard. As the weeks turned into months, the double homicide of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills began to fade from the front pages. The headlines shrank, the cameras left. Savannah's historic district returned to its slow rhythm, tourists taking pictures under oak trees, horse carriages clattering down cobblestone streets. But for the detectives on the case, the silence was deafening. Detective Lucas Moore sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at photographs of the crime scene spread across his desk. He had seen violent cases before, but this one gnawed at him. Everything about it screamed personal. No forced entry, no theft, overkill wounds. These weren't the actions of a stranger. They were the actions of someone who knew Lisa and Cole deeply, maybe even loved them once. But despite the careful evidence collection, every lead hit a dead end. The fingerprint was smudged. The blood evidence couldn't be processed beyond basic typing. DNA testing existed in 1995, but it was slow, expensive, and unreliable for small samples. The hair found clutched in Lisa's hand didn't have follicles attached, which meant no DNA could be extracted. It was like having the puzzle pieces, but no picture to guide you. The Savannah Police Department interviewed over 50 people: co-workers, ex-partners, classmates, neighbors. Each time they thought they had a suspect, the evidence fizzled out. Lisa's recent breakup with a hospital colleague raised suspicion, but he was working in Jacksonville the night of the murders, confirmed by time-stamped hospital records. Cole's former students adored him. No enemies, no threats, nothing. And so, as the calendar flipped to 1996, the Adams-Mills file was quietly reclassified, open but inactive. A polite way of saying cold case. Years slipped by. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. The memory of that horrific night dulled, except for a few people who could never let it go. Lisa's parents made the 4-hour drive to Savannah every December, leaving flowers on her grave. Cole's mother would sit beside his headstone, whispering prayers into the wind. And somewhere across town, Dustin Moss, the killer, went about his life, smiling, coaching, selling pharmaceuticals. Each year that passed made him bolder, more certain that he had gotten away with it. Yet time was quietly working against him. In police storage, sealed inside climate-controlled boxes, the evidence waited, preserved by sheer chance. The partial fingerprint, the hair, the small droplets of blood found near the kitchen sink, the ones Moore had insisted they collect, just in case. He'd written one last line in his report before closing the file in 1996. Advances in forensic science may someday speak for the dead. At the time, it was just a note, a wish. But 2 decades later, that line would become prophecy. Because when DNA technology finally evolved, when science learned to listen to even the faintest whisper left behind, the silence that had haunted Savannah for 25 years would finally break. By 2015, the world had changed, and so had forensic science. DNA technology, once an expensive and uncertain process, had become the gold standard of criminal investigation. Across the United States, a federal grant poured millions into re-examining unsolved cases, and in Georgia, that meant dusty shelves of forgotten evidence were about to breathe again. One of those cases was the 1995 Savannah double homicide, the murder of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills. For 2 decades, their file had sat untouched, sealed in plastic bins labeled cold case. The samples inside, dried blood, hair strands, swabs from doorknobs, were small, fragile, but miraculously intact. And they were about to change everything. Special Agent Camilla Reeves of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had made a career out of chasing ghosts. She specialized in old evidence, cases long thought impossible to solve. Her team's mission was simple: find DNA that modern science could decode. As she opened the Adams-Mills evidence box for the first time, she noticed Detective Moore's meticulous notes, his handwriting neat and careful. On one page, a single sentence caught her attention. "The killer may have injured himself. Check blood by the kitchen sink." Reeves sent the sample for advanced DNA analysis, something that hadn't even existed in 1995. At the same time, her lab was processing another case, a 1990 sexual assault kit from Atlanta that had never been tested due to backlogs and funding shortages. The two cases seemed completely unrelated until the computers said otherwise. On March 17, 2016, a notification appeared on the GBI's database: DNA match found. The profile from the 1990 assault matched the blood recovered from Lisa Adams's kitchen. 2 crimes, 5 years apart, 1 man. Reeves froze, staring at the screen. It was like 2 cold cases reaching out across time to point at the same face. She immediately pulled both case files, one labeled Adams-Mills homicide, the other Blake sexual assault. The victim of that earlier assault was a nursing student named Jennifer Blake, who'd accused a fellow student of attacking her after a college party, a man named Dustin Moss. The name hit her like a jolt. Dustin Moss wasn't just a suspect from a 1990 assault. He was also listed as a friend and witness in the 1995 Savannah murders. He'd been interviewed, cleared, even attended the victims' funerals. Reeves leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. The connection was impossible to ignore. 2 decades apart, 2 victims linked by the same DNA, and 1 man who'd built a spotless life under the radar. When she called Captain Lucas Moore, now retired but still haunted by that case, the line went quiet for a long moment. Then Moore exhaled and said, "I knew it. I always knew he was too clean." For the first time in 25 years, the case wasn't cold anymore. The blood that once whispered was finally speaking, and what it said was devastating. The name Dustin Moss had once meant nothing more than another line in a dusty cold case file. But when Agent Camilla Reeves connected the DNA from the 1990 assault to the 1995 double murder, his name became a thunderclap in Savannah's quiet history. Suddenly, 2 separate crimes, years and miles apart, were no longer coincidences. They were threads in a single sinister pattern. Reeves dug deep into the 1990 case file from Atlanta. The victim, Jennifer Blake, had been just 19, a nursing student with her whole life ahead of her. One night after a college Christmas party, she accepted a ride home from a fellow student she barely knew, Dustin Moss. But instead of taking her home, he drove to an isolated area behind a sports complex. Jennifer later told police that he turned violent, attacking her before leaving her bruised and terrified. She reported him immediately, and though the assault kit was collected, the case was never prosecuted. Moss had powerful friends, a clean record, and no solid DNA technology to prove anything. Without physical evidence, the district attorney dropped the charges. Jennifer moved away and never looked back. But that forgotten kit, sealed and untouched for 25 years, had preserved a truth that would finally resurface. The DNA recovered from her assault was identical to the sample found at Lisa Adams's kitchen sink. The odds of coincidence? 1 in a trillion. As Reeves pieced the timeline together, a disturbing picture emerged. After the assault, Moss had quietly transferred schools, reinvented himself, and worked his way into a respected career in pharmaceutical sales. Along the way, he stayed in touch with Lisa Adams, his old high school friend, and reconnected with Cole Mills through mutual acquaintances. To everyone, Dustin was charming, attentive, a good guy. But Reeves began to suspect something darker beneath the surface, a man who thrived on control, whose ego couldn't stand rejection. Reeves found that just weeks before their murders, Lisa had mentioned to a co-worker that she was uncomfortable with a friend's behavior. someone who'd been texting late and acting weird. The coworker couldn't recall the name, but phone records filled the blanks. Dozens of late-night calls from Dustin Moss. Messages filled with guilt, apologies, and veiled resentment. Suddenly, everything clicked. The lack of forced entry, the familiarity, the rage. Lisa had likely let him in that night, believing he was just a friend in distress. Cole, protective as always, may have stepped in when things turned heated. What followed was chaos, years of buried violence erupting all at once. When Agent Reeves presented her findings to the Chatham County District Attorney, the room went silent. It wasn't just new evidence. It was a revelation. The same man who had wept at their funeral, who had built a family, who had fooled an entire city, had left a piece of himself behind in blood. And now, after 25 years of silence, that blood had finally come back to name him. By the spring of 2020, the walls around Dustin Moss's carefully constructed life were closing in, though he didn't know it yet. He still lived in Savannah, in a quiet neighborhood where kids rode bikes and porch lights glowed warm in the evenings. To his neighbors, he was the model of stability, a devoted husband, a father of two, a respected pharmaceutical rep who volunteered at the local church. No one could have imagined that behind that charming smile lay the face of a killer. When Agent Camilla Reeves and her team finalized the DNA report, they knew the next step had to be flawless. One mistake could let Moss slip through their fingers. So they worked quietly, piecing together a case that would leave no room for doubt. They revisited old witnesses, tracked down Moss's former classmates, and re-interviewed anyone who might have noticed something off back in 1995. The more they learned, the more chilling the picture became. One neighbor recalled that days after the murders, Moss had shown up at Lisa's house, uninvited, asking if the police had any suspects yet. Another remembered him at the candlelight vigil, pacing, sweaty despite the cold night air. But the most disturbing moment came from Lisa's roommate, Melissa Jenkins, who told investigators she remembered something strange. At the funeral, when Moss hugged her, she felt a cut on his hand, a small healing scar. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now it made her shiver. By June, the GBI had everything they needed. DNA from the 1995 crime scene, a match from the 1990 assault, a behavioral pattern spanning decades. They obtained a covert warrant to collect a fresh DNA sample, something recent to confirm without doubt that Dustin Moss was their man. Agents followed him for weeks, watching his daily routine, morning jogs, coffee runs, his visits to local clinics for work. One afternoon, after he tossed a used coffee cup into a public trash can, they swooped in. The cup was rushed to the lab, and within days, the results came back. A perfect match. Reeves called her team together. "We've got him," she said simply. The arrest took place early one morning in July. Moss was leaving his driveway when unmarked cars surrounded him. Neighbors watched in disbelief as agents approached, weapons drawn. He looked more confused than afraid, as if the past he had buried so deeply couldn't possibly have followed him here. In the interrogation room, Moss remained calm at first. "There's been a mistake," he insisted. But when Reeves laid out the photos, the DNA chart, the 1990 police report, the blood evidence, something inside him cracked. His composure faltered. His hands trembled. "It was an accident," he whispered finally. They wouldn't stop yelling. It was the first and only confession he'd ever give. After 25 years of pretending, Dustin Moss was unmasked, not by witnesses or luck, but by the quiet persistence of truth preserved in a drop of blood. When the trial of Dustin Moss began in early 2022, Savannah was transfixed. It had been nearly 3 decades since Lisa Adams and Cole Mills were murdered, but the wounds in the community had never truly healed. Now, the man who had lived among them, who had mourned with them, was sitting in the defendant's chair, wearing a dark suit and an expression that flickered between arrogance and disbelief. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every bench, their pens scratching like insects. Lisa's parents sat side by side, holding hands tightly. Cole's mother clutched a rosary, whispering silent prayers. When Moss entered, not a sound could be heard, just the rustle of paper and the faint hum of cameras outside. For the families, this wasn't just a trial. It was a resurrection of grief, a reopening of every wound they'd learned to live with. District Attorney Mary Ann Keller opened with a line that silenced the room. For 25 years, he lived free because science hadn't learned how to listen yet. But today, DNA speaks louder than lies. She walked the jury through the evidence, the blood found by the kitchen sink, the matching profile from the 1990 assault kit, the fresh DNA sample from the discarded coffee cup. The odds of error. 1 in 1 trillion, she said firmly. She projected photos of the crime scene, explaining the sequence of events reconstructed by forensic experts, Lisa's defensive wounds, Cole's position near the door, and the trail of blood that matched Moss's genetic profile. The defense tried everything. They claimed contamination, mishandling, even suggested another unknown assailant could have been present. But with every counter-argument, Keller calmly dismantled their points, piece by piece. This wasn't contamination, she said. It was him, trying to clean up after himself and leaving behind the one thing he couldn't erase. When Melissa Jenkins took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke softly, describing how she'd found her roommate's body that morning, how Moss had seemed too calm at the funeral, and how she'd noticed the healing cut on his hand. Her voice trembled, but she didn't falter. "I thought he was grieving," she said. "But now I know what I was really looking at." After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. Guilty on all counts. Moss stared straight ahead, expression blank, as if the words hadn't registered. But when the judge pronounced the sentence, 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, his mask finally broke. His hands shook. His eyes watered. For the first time, the calm, composed facade of Dustin Moss was gone, replaced by something raw, fear. As officers led him away, Lisa's father whispered, "Justice doesn't forget." And for the first time in 25 years, Savannah exhaled. When the gavel struck for the final time, the courtroom didn't erupt in cheers or applause. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that carries more weight than words ever could. For Lisa Adams and Cole Mills, justice had finally spoken. 25 years too late, perhaps, but it had spoken all the same. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with emotion. Families embraced, tears mixing with relief and exhaustion. Reporters clustered around the steps, but no one from either family sought the spotlight. Lisa's mother simply said, "We waited half our lives for this day. I just wish Lisa and Cole could see how hard we fought for them." Her husband stood beside her, eyes red but proud. "It's over," he whispered. "She can rest now." Inside the prison transport van, Dustin Moss sat in shackles, staring out the small window as Savannah's streets blurred by. He wasn't headed home this time. He was headed to Georgia State Prison, where he would spend the rest of his life replaying the moment everything unraveled. The man who once walked freely among mourners, who smiled for cameras, who fooled a city for decades, now had nothing left but his thoughts. Detective Lucas Moore, long retired, came out of retirement just to attend the sentencing. He stood quietly in the back, his silver hair glinting under the courtroom lights. When he spoke to reporters afterward, his words carried the weight of both satisfaction and sorrow. "I promised myself this case wouldn't die with me," he said, and it didn't. DNA spoke for the dead, and the dead were finally heard. The ripple effect of the case stretched far beyond Savannah. It became a symbol of what modern forensic science could achieve, of how even the smallest trace, preserved against time, could bring truth to light. Across the country, cold case units began re-examining their oldest files, inspired by what happened here. A single drop of blood had become a beacon of hope. For the people of Savannah, though, the legacy of Lisa and Cole wasn't defined by the brutality of their deaths, but by the goodness of their lives. A memorial bench now sits under a sprawling oak in Forsyth Park, engraved with their names and the words, "Friendship endures where memory lives." Every spring, former students, nurses, and neighbors gather there to tell stories about Lisa's kindness, Cole's laughter, and how their friendship inspired a community. Some call it closure, others call it justice, but for those who loved them, it's something deeper, a reminder that even when evil hides behind smiles, truth has a way of finding its voice. In the end, the killer thought he'd buried his sins under time and charm. But time doesn't forget. And DNA, that silent witness to every secret, made sure he never got away again.